Episode 58, Deities for the New Homeowners. It was a period in time where buying a home required patience, as it was in demand and those looking to buy a house would need to wait at least a couple of years before they could get the chance to own one. For Richard and his wife, Rena, they were thrilled to finally receive a call from their housing agent, Tommy, who said, "Hey, Richard, there is a house owner that is open to selling in the area you wanted, and it's within your budget." Richard then said, "That's great. Let's set up a meeting to view the house." Tommy then replied, "Okay, sure, Richard, but I just want to let you know that it may not be suitable for you." "What do you mean?" asked Richard. With a sigh, Tommy then said, "From what I heard, the current owners are rigorous practitioners of their faith and have plenty of deities in the house. So, I'm not sure if you'd be comfortable with it." Richard insisted and said, "That's no problem at all. Let's take a look at it." Later that week, the couple, along with Tommy, visited the home. When they arrived, they were welcomed by the elderly couple homeowners. They went in, and that was when Richard and Rena finally saw what Tommy meant about the deities. The house was filled with them. Every corner had a statue. On the TV console were a couple more, and a tall wooden cabinet set near the kitchen had multiple pieces of deities as well. Richard was unfazed. He still looked thrilled as he was envisioning how he would be renovating the home. Meanwhile, Rena didn't share the same excitement. Rena then asked Tommy, "Oh yeah, Tommy, why do the elderly couple not want to bring these deities with them once they move out?" Tommy then replied, "From what I heard, they believe that these deities shouldn't be moved as it will anger the spirits. So they are respecting the deities and decided to leave them here for the next owners." Rena then asked Richard, "Honey, I know I've been waiting to buy a house for a long time, but we should maybe reconsider this. We have to be honest here. You're not particularly close to your faith." In his usual proud stance, Richard then said, "That's nonsense. We can decide later if we want to have it in the home or throw it away. That's just a small matter. I think this house is really good for us." Tommy, who was standing right by them, then said, "Okay, Richard, if you're willing to buy this home, I will let the owner know in the coming days. But hopefully you can just give a final thought about whether this is right for you and Rena." Richard interrupted Tommy and said, "Nah, it's fine. The house is spacious and we have the money to renovate all of this." A couple of months went by and finally the couple moved into the house. The house floor was renovated and now covered in marble. The home had a Scandinavia theme to it, with light-colored walls and modern-designed glass panels. There was barely anything that resembled how it once looked. The only thing that was the same were the deities. So, as the couple stood in their new living room looking around, Richard then told Rena, I'm still thinking of throwing these deities away. It would definitely make our house look more modern." Rena then said, "No, you promised. I told you before we bought the home that if you want me to agree in buying this home, we need to respect the deities. If we can't, we shouldn't even buy it." "Relax, I know I promised, but just think about it. Think about how much nicer our house would look if we threw them away," said Richard. Rena was clear on her stance and said, "No, like we discussed before, I won't compromise on this. We have to be respectful, especially as the new owners here." Richard brushed off the conversation as he knew that one day he would find a way to remove the deities anyway. So, one night, while Rena was overseas on a business trip, Richard was alone at home after work. Richard thought to himself, "This is the perfect time for me to remove these deities. I can take my time, and when Rena comes back, I'll just let her know that the deity's cabinet fell and it broke, so I had to throw them away. Yeah, she'll believe me. Then I'll just have these smaller ones at the corner left to throw away. I guess I have to think of some excuse again in the future to get rid of the rest." So Richard walked towards the cabinet and had both hands on it. Richard tried to shift the cabinet. It was heavy, but he persevered, and the cabinet finally moved slightly. Richard thought to himself, "Great, it's finally moving. I'll get it out in no time." Richard continued pulling it towards the front door. But as he was still pulling the cabinet, to his surprise, he heard his front door open. It was Rena. Richard stood there stunned and asked, "Hey, babe, I thought you would only be back in 2 days' time. Did the business trip end earlier than expected?" Rena just stood there, looking upset. Rena then said, "Put it back," and went to the bedroom. Richard kept quiet and slowly shifted the cabinet back. But while doing so, Richard then thought, "Damn it, why did my wife suddenly come home? I wonder if something went wrong with the trip. Well, it's late, so I guess I'll let her sleep it off, and hopefully she'll be in a better mood tomorrow." Richard then awkwardly went to the room. Richard saw Rena sitting on the bed, with her back facing him, and without saying anything, Richard immediately went into the washroom to shower. Once done, Richard got out of the shower. He could see Rena lying on the bed sideways away from him. Knowing that the situation was still awkward, Richard lay down and tried to sleep. But right as Richard was about to doze off, he could hear Rena getting out of bed and walking out of the room. Richard didn't move and pretended to have fallen asleep. So, when he could hear Rena opening the room door and walking into the living room, Richard peeked open his eyes to have a look. From his view, Richard could partially see the living room. The living room lights were off, but Richard could somewhat see Rena. Rena walked around the living room. Richard thought, "What is she doing?" Richard observed as Rena then circled the living room table. Rena then stopped. She turned towards the Deities cabinet near the kitchen and slowly walked toward it. Richard was curious, and part of him wanted to go out to the living room and ask Rena what she was doing. But part of him still wanted to observe what she was up to. Richard then saw Rena go on her knees as she was still facing the cabinet. She slowly bowed and sat back up straight again. Rena continued doing so a couple more times again before walking towards the kitchen. Rena was now out of Richard's sight. Richard felt something was wrong, so he stopped pretending to sleep and got up. But right when he got out of bed and walked towards the living room, Richard heard a whisper from the back that whispered, "Hey, honey." As the voice sounded like Rena's, Richard instinctively turned around. Before Richard could say anything, he saw what seemed like his wife in the bedroom, standing on the bed. Her pupils turned full white as she stood silent, glaring at Richard. Richard immediately knew that it wasn't his wife, and now he began to realize that it probably wasn't Rena, who earlier came home. Richard wanted to make a run for it, but he couldn't control himself. He was frozen as he saw the figure beginning to open her mouth. Her mouth gradually stretched, wider and longer, as it continued to stare at Richard. The figure's mouth continued opening until it stretched almost close to their bedroom floor. The figure then let out a hysterical scream. The extreme fear seemed to have unfroze Richard as he ran out of the bedroom and dashed across his living room towards the front door. Richard wasn't thinking anymore at this point. All his movements were purely instinctive. One of his hands reached for the key box right next to the front door. He pulled out a set of keys as his trembling hands were looking through the keys to find the right one, doing all this while in the dark. He could feel that there was something looking behind him. Richard was so terrified that he could feel his vision turning blurry. He could hear the furniture behind him moving, but he didn't care. He just wanted to find the right keys. That was when Richard realized that his door didn't need keys to unlock from the inside. He unlocked the door and opened it. It was slightly brighter now with the lights from the street lamps. Richard could now see the key that would unlock his gate. He pushed through the key in the lock, turned it to unlock, swung open the gate, and ran out as fast as he could. Richard ran to the closest street lamp next to his neighbor's home. He gathered his breath as he thought about what had happened earlier while seated and leaned against the street lamp. Exhausted from the long night, Richard eventually fell asleep. He was woken up by his neighbor in the morning as Richard shared what had happened last night. Richard then used his neighbor's phone to call his wife, and, as expected, she was still overseas, far away from home. Richard's neighbor then accompanied him to gather some of his things as Richard slept at a hotel for the next few days until Rena got back home. And after many arguments and discussions with Rena, Richard was finally able to convince Rena to agree to sell off their new home. Richard never saw the figure again, but never forgot the lesson he learned that night. Richard was never the same. No longer was he the egotistical man that he once was. Never did he disrespect any deities or any other faiths again. All thanks to the spirit that resembled Rena.